Okay, I don't really know how to follow that. But I think hopefully I'll share with you some thoughts about, I guess, the whole discussion that people are talking about deradicalization, about what it is, why do people join such groups, what is it that attracts people towards violent extremism and so on. And primarily what I've been kind of tasked with is to talk about, something that I guess is talk about me, is essentially how I ended up joining a group. When I was 15, I ended up joining Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is a revolutionary Islamist party. It's a party and a group which has a vision which we're all, unfortunately, far too familiar with now, of a caliphate, an Islamist state, which breaks down borders and barriers between states, which enforces its own version of what it sees as God's divine law and wrath over society, does so through the power of state and politics, and seeks to spread this state across the entirety of the Muslim majority countries with the hope of them bringing that version of religion, that version of Islam to the rest of the world. Essentially, Hizb ut-Tahrir had the same vision, had the same ideological ends. Our methodology was revolutionary and not directly instigating violence, but instigating militaries to have coups, to take over countries and bring those countries under a divine rule, which they saw as being the only true Islamic state and the only true caliphate. And often when I speak to people, they find it difficult to understand why anybody would at all be interested in joining such a group. Why is it that anybody growing up, as I did, in one of the greatest cities in the world, Sheffield, I'm sure you've all heard of it, one of the greatest cities in the world, which was actually a multicultural city in the truest sense. I grew up with people who belonged to all walks of life, socially, culturally, ethnically, racially, religiously. I didn't face discrimination actually for my religious, for my color or my religion. There was a little bit of inter-religious and interracial fighting between us. I'm sure you'd be surprised to hear that sometimes people of the same religion don't get on, or people from different ethnic minorities don't get on. But essentially, I didn't suffer and I wasn't disenfranchised. But there were a few things that struck out and called to me that struck a chord when I was 15. The first was actually to do with my identity, to do with my, if you like, how I saw myself. Because identities are quite diverse. And there's an analogy that's used in a play about an onion, that you can peel away one identity and lead to another. And yes, I was someone that grew up in Sheffield as a Yorkshireman. We say there are two types of people from Yorkshire and everybody else. And at the same time, I grew up within Sheffield. I also grew up from an ethnic minority. My parents were from the Indian subcontinent. I also recognized that I was someone that had a religious identity as a Muslim. And that was slightly different to the rest of society. Wasn't necessarily persecuted. I wasn't necessarily isolated, but it was a different self-perception that I had of myself that was there to be manipulated. It was something that also resounded with my sense of belonging to other people outside of wider society. That at the same time in the 90s, in the mid-90s, that there was things happening like what was going on in Bosnia, where white, blonde, blue-eyed, or brunettes who were ostensibly Serbian, but they were called Bosniaks or Bosnians, were being persecuted because of their apparent cultural heritage. They weren't necessarily known for their fundamentalism or even conservative religious culture, but their cultural heritage, which was from a Muslim background. And this kind of sense of belonging, this kind of attachment and growing up recognizing, hold on a second, there is maybe something different about those people, because we stood by for a long time and let them die. We stood by for a long time and let massacres take place. Rather like we have done in Syria now, where we've stood by to 300,000 people at least being killed, another few 100,000 disappeared, several million, figures between 11 and 14 million dispersed. And we've stood by and allowed that to happen, whilst celebrating, or rather not celebrating, but commemorating the end of the Second World War and its 75th anniversary of the Battle of Britain was last week. Sorry? Okay, 3 minutes. So essentially, those things were what were essentially utilized by people to manipulate me to embrace an ideology which said, you're not really British, you're not really part of Western society, you are Muslim. Your Muslim identity is a global political identity. You adopt it as part of this global heritage. You stand up, and as I grew up in Sheffield, we were fairly left-wing, you stand up against capitalism. And you have this alternative ideological agenda, rather like many of us may remember, you adopt a framework of the Islamist ideology. Like socialism, it's an alternative to capitalism. It's one that will bring a political bloc together that will challenge the world order. And it is this caliphate that will establish a global supremacist state that will solve the problems of the world, whether it's Bosnia, whether it's Kashmir, whether it's the Palestine-Israel conflict, because we will unify our armies together, we will unify our economies, we won't have money in Saudi Arabia and Qatar, we'll have it across the world. It will be under one singular leadership, and that global Islamist state will then solve these problems in a utopian manner, just like all other utopian ideologues had called for. And it was those things, the intellectual, the political, and the religious identity that come together that unify people within these groups. So now in the last minute and a half that I have, just to finish off, what is it that took me away from these things? Well, the first thing obviously is being able to recognize this ideology itself was like all other ideologies. It had its own agendas and interests. It was a set of ideas which was not at all in touch with the political world that we live in. It was one which had its own framework of thinking that it wanted to enforce. It was amoral. It didn't care about good and bad because the greater good can always be manipulated. Whether it was for Stalin, whether it is for Mao, or whether it is for Islamist terrorists. The criteria of the greater good is always a criteria that can be utilized for the killing and the murder of innocent civilians. In fact, we've seen that very same criteria being used for us to stumble around what's happening in Syria, when it started off with, well, maybe if we intervene, it'll get worse. And then, damn, it's got worse. And then, now it's too late, we can't do anything. All of this because actually we're too afraid of actually intervening, because never again doesn't really mean never again. We live through seeing it all the time. But coming back, moving away from that, you realize this totalitarian ideology itself is something that's fundamentally amoral. You realize it's irreligious as well, because whilst it utilizes the trappings of religion and scripture, actually anyone that knows anything about Muslims and Islam and heritage and Islamic practice knows it's as diverse as any other religion. And I don't need to come to Geneva to talk about the history of religion, religious conflict, sectarianism, and so on. But essentially the idea that it's, and my time's up, but essentially you realize that actually the nature of Islam is one that is massively diverse. And once you're able to realize this, you're able to move away from that political ideology. The diversity within Islamic tradition makes you realize that their narrow reading of religious tradition is something that you need to stay far away from. And finally, you start to realize that you can maintain your identity, and you can do so by standing up for justice. That actually the thing that keeps us together, whether it's the individuals, you're not going to stop individuals being radicalized while there's tyranny and injustice. We're not going to stop ISIS whilst Assad is literally dropping barrel bombs around the whole of his society, killing hundreds of thousands of people, and we stand back. There'll always be enough people ready to join extreme causes whilst you have such tyranny and oppression. And I'm just going to end with a saying of one of these very medieval theologians and scholars that groups like extremists quote and cite. His name was Ibn Taymiyyah, and he was a 9th century scholar, and he said, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَنْصُرُ دَوْلَةَ الْعَادِلَ إِنْ كَانَتْ ظَالِمَةً. God would never, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَنْصُرُ دَوْلَةَ الْمُؤْمِنَةَ إِنْ كَانَتْ ظَالِمَةً. God would never merely support a country or a state which claims to be godly or religious purely just because of that claim, if it was in fact a tyrannical state. وَلَكِنْ يَنْصُرُ الدَّوْلَةَ الْعَادِلَةَ إِنْ كَانَتْ كَافِرَةً. Even if it was outwardly unbelieving, but it was a just state, then surely that is a state that has God's succor. And that was my last thing I wanted to end on, that only through justice for the individual, for communities, for societies, and only by working and bringing about justice can we really hope for peace. Otherwise, it's just a meaningless maintaining of the status quo, which is 1,440 deaths a day.